It was one of those winter mornings when the cold didn't simply settle on the city, it took hold of it entirely, creeping into bricks, bones, and breath alike. The streets had turned silent, coated in ice and exhaustion, with even the air itself hanging low and heavy as if burdened by the weight of the season. Cars passed slowly. People moved quickly, heads down, scarves pulled tight, eyes avoiding anything that might pull them out of their insulated routines. On a forgotten street at the edge of a crumbling neighborhood, near a row of shuttered storefronts and boarded-up homes, a dog stood motionless. His thin body trembled violently, his fur matted and clumped with wet snow. His eyes, wide and hollow with something deeper than fear, were fixed on a closed door that hadn't been opened in weeks. The dog didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply stared, ears stiff, breath fogging softly from his nose, as if he were waiting for something that had once promised to return. The door in front of him was a faded green, with peeling paint and rust around the hinges. Its frame leaned slightly to the side, as if the house behind it had begun to give up on holding itself upright. No lights glowed through the cracks in the windows. No footsteps echoed inside. The world had long since passed that house by. But the dog didn't move. Whatever was beyond that door meant more to him than shelter alone. Down the street, pushing a cart filled with tattered blankets and crushed cans, a woman moved slowly. Her name was Elsie, though most people in the neighborhood didn't know it. To them, she was just another soul trying to stay alive through the winter. Her coat was patched at the elbows, and her boots were held together by string. But her eyes still searched every alley, every corner, not for money or food, but for signs of life that hadn't given up. She had learned to recognize pain in silence, how it moved, how it hid, how it sometimes waited for someone else to see it. That's why she stopped when she saw the dog. He was too still, too focused, too desperate for someone who had seen too much. She approached slowly, not wanting to scare him. But he didn't flinch. His gaze never shifted from the door, even as her shadow drew closer. Something about the moment, the cold, the quiet, the intensity of the dog's posture, told her this was no ordinary stray. This dog wasn't lost. He was waiting. Elsie knelt beside him, her knees pressing into the snow, her hand outstretched without expectation. When her fingers brushed his side, she felt how thin he was. Skin beneath fur, bone beneath skin. Still, he didn't react. He only trembled harder, as if the contact reminded him of something his body had tried to forget. She followed his eyes to the door, studying it carefully. There was no sound from within, no movement. But something pulled at her, the kind of pull that didn't come from logic, but from instinct. Something was wrong. She stood and tried the doorknob. Locked. Her hand lingered there for a moment before retreating. She wasn't the kind of person to trespass, not even after all the years of being treated like she didn't belong anywhere. But this didn't feel like trespassing. This felt like answering a question. She walked around the side of the building, where a row of sagging steps led to a basement door almost entirely hidden beneath snow. She pushed against it, half expecting it to crumble under her weight, and to her surprise, it gave way with a reluctant groan. The inside of the house was colder than the street. The air smelled like rot and old wood, thick with the kind of silence that didn't come from emptiness, but from absence. Elsie stepped carefully, her boots crunching broken glass and dust. Every wall was bare, every surface coated in neglect. But something deeper than abandonment hung in the space. She moved slowly through the rooms, her breath visible in the air, until she reached the front hallway, the one behind the door the dog had been staring at. She paused, and then she saw it. In the corner near the baseboard, half hidden beneath a fallen coat rack, was a figure. Small, still, and barely visible in the dim light filtering through the window. A child. Curled tightly against the wall, arms around her knees, face pale and eyes wide open, not in sleep, but in shock. The dog outside wasn't waiting for an owner. He had been guarding her. Watching that door like a soldier, refusing to leave because he knew someone was still inside, someone who couldn't call out. Elsie rushed forward, her heartbeat thundering in her chest, as the girl flinched at the movement. She was alive, barely. Her lips were cracked, her skin too cold, and her clothes soaked through from the freezing air. She couldn't speak. She only looked up with the kind of gaze that had forgotten what help even meant. Without a second thought, Elsie wrapped her coat around the child and lifted her into her arms. She was lighter than expected, frighteningly so, but Elsie held her close, whispering softly, not knowing if the girl could hear, only knowing she had to try. Outside, the dog barked for the first time. A single, sharp cry that pierced the silence like glass. He watched as Elsie stepped out with the girl wrapped in her arms, his body tense with urgency, his eyes pleading. And for the first time, Elsie realized he wasn't just watching the door. He had stayed there to make sure someone would come. Someone who could do what he couldn't. Someone who would listen. Someone who wouldn't walk past. She placed the girl gently into the cart, surrounding her with every blanket she had, and the dog jumped up beside her, pressing his body close to hers, warming her with everything he had left. As Elsie began to push the cart down the street toward the shelter, the snow fell heavier. But she didn't feel the cold anymore. She felt only the weight of what had been found behind that door. The fear, the silence, the devotion of an animal who refused to leave the one he loved behind. And though the world outside kept moving, oblivious to what had just been uncovered, something had shifted. Because sometimes, what saves us is not the sound of a siren or the glare of a spotlight. Sometimes, it's the stillness of a dog staring at a door, waiting for someone to care enough to open it. The walk to the shelter felt longer than usual, not because of the distance, but because of what the cart carried now. Elsie moved slowly through the slush-covered sidewalks, the wheels of the cart wobbling over cracks and patches of frozen gravel. Her shoulders leaned forward against the wind, her hands red and raw from the cold gripping the metal frame. Every few steps, she would glance down into the cart, where the little girl lay motionless beneath a patchwork of blankets, her breath shallow, her lips still too pale. The dog, still unnamed but no longer unknown, lay beside her like a sentinel, his body curled protectively, his eyes fixed upward, never blinking for too long. He watched Elsie with trust but also with expectation, as if silently urging her not to stop, not to lose momentum, not to fail. The city paid no mind to them. People passed without looking, too wrapped in scarves and thoughts to notice. Cars honked in frustration at intersections, steam rose from sewer grates, and windows shimmered with heat lamps in cafes they would never enter. Yet within that indifference, something quietly miraculous moved, a woman no one saw, pushing a child no one knew, guarded by a dog no one claimed. Together they traveled, not with urgency, but with the calm determination of survivors who didn't need to be seen to know they mattered. By the time they reached the shelter, the light had begun to fade. The building stood hunched between two taller, cleaner structures, its bricks weathered by years of wind and smoke. A metal sign above the entrance read, Haven Center, though most people in the neighborhood simply called it, the Hall. It wasn't much, but it was a place with heat, with soup, with questions asked gently and names never demanded. Elsie had come here often for a night's warmth or a bowl of something hot. But tonight, she didn't come for herself. Tonight, she came carrying something far heavier than her own exhaustion. Inside, the shelter was already full of shuffling bodies and murmured conversation. The air was thick with the scent of wet coats and old bread, the sound of boots echoing on tile floors. When Elsie entered, dragging the cart behind her, the room quieted. Eyes turned, not in judgment, but in a recognition that something unusual had arrived. A volunteer approached, young and uncertain, his mouth already forming questions before he saw the child. Then he moved quickly, calling out for help, leading Elsie down a hallway toward a back room rarely used except for emergencies. The girl was lifted from the cart with care. Her eyes barely opened, her hands too stiff to move, but she whimpered softly as she was placed on a cot and covered in warm layers. Medical volunteers gathered, checking her pulse, warming her limbs, whispering between themselves. Elsie stood back, watching, her chest tightening as she saw them surround the child, not as a case, but as a person. They didn't ask where she had come from, not yet. They simply acted. Sometimes, action said more than any question could. The dog refused to leave the child's side. When they tried to move him away, he growled low, not in threat, but in protest. Eventually, they allowed him to stay, curling beside the girl once again as if he knew his presence mattered more than any medicine. Elsie sat on a folding chair near the wall, her fingers still trembling, her legs numb, her body finally catching up to the storm it had endured. But she didn't sleep. Her eyes remained open, locked on the child and the dog, the two silent survivors now held in warmth that didn't belong to her but had become part of her story nonetheless. Hours passed. Somewhere outside, the snow began again. Somewhere down the hall, a kettle whistled and papers shuffled. But in that room, the quiet was different. It was not the silence of neglect, but of stillness, of waiting, of a fragile hope not yet ready to speak aloud. A nurse eventually came and sat beside Elsie, offering a small cup of tea and a blanket. She took them without a word, nodding once. They didn't ask her name. They didn't ask her story. They saw what she had done and let that speak for her. When the girl finally stirred, it was the dog she reached for first. Her hand moved, barely, to touch his fur, and his tail thumped softly in response. That moment, brief and almost missed, meant everything. It was a sign that she had not drifted beyond the edge. That whatever had trapped her behind that door hadn't won. Not yet. Elsie exhaled slowly, her breath finally releasing something she had been holding in since she'd first seen those wide eyes fixed on the green door. Later, as the night deepened and most of the shelter fell into exhausted sleep, Elsie stepped outside for air. She stood beneath the awning, watching snow gather on the empty streets, the city slowing into stillness. And though her body ached and her future remained as uncertain as the wind's next turn, she felt, for the first time in years, that she had placed something right in a world that often felt crooked. The child inside might never know her name. The dog might never leave her side. But in that fragile constellation of strangers, something had been repaired. She looked up at the sky, snowflakes melting against her skin, and whispered thanks to no one in particular. Then she stepped back inside, closed the door against the cold, and returned to the warmth she had helped create. By morning, the storm had thickened its grip on the city, blanketing the rooftops in heavy snow and muffling every sound beneath a hush that seemed to press down from the sky itself. Within the shelter, a quiet rhythm unfolded as it always did. Coffee poured into chipped mugs, blankets folded, volunteers exchanging tired nods. Yet in the far room near the back, the air held a different kind of stillness. The girl had slept through the night without incident, her breathing deeper, her skin less pale, though her eyes had yet to fully awaken. The dog remained beside her, unmoved, as though the weight of what he'd endured with her had rooted him permanently in place. He seemed to understand that his role wasn't over yet, that his vigil was not finished. Elsie sat nearby, legs crossed, sipping slowly from a lukewarm cup of tea she hadn't asked for but gratefully accepted. Her mind moved in slow waves, replaying everything she'd seen, trying to make sense of how a child could be left alone in a house like that, silent and freezing behind a locked door. Something inside her whispered that this wasn't just a case of neglect or accident. There was something deeper, something hidden in the quiet. The way the girl hadn't cried, hadn't spoken, hadn't shown even the startled panic that children often did when rescued. Instead, she had accepted the rescue like someone who had already learned no one would come. One of the shelter workers approached her gently, carrying a clipboard and speaking in tones meant to sound casual but measured, the kind used when treading lightly around things fragile and uncertain. They had questions now, basic ones. The police had been notified, as was protocol when a child was found in such a state. But there were no missing person reports matching her description, no recent cases involving a girl her age. No one had come forward. She wasn't listed in any active system. It was as if she had simply vanished from the world, and no one had noticed. Elsie answered what she could, which wasn't much. She told them about the door, the dog, the silence, the house that felt like it hadn't been touched in weeks. She described the child's stillness, the way she had been curled up not in fear, but in a kind of waiting. The volunteer took notes, nodding slowly, his eyes flicking between Elsie's tired face and the child resting behind her. They would follow up, he said. They would search property records, speak with neighbors, look for cameras. But Elsie could already feel it. the slow erosion of urgency that so often accompanied stories without names or addresses. The system required data, identifiers, documentation. This child had none. And in that absence, she risked being forgotten all over again. But not by Elsie. That afternoon, when the storm quieted just enough for movement outside, Elsie returned to the house. She didn't go out of curiosity. She went because something told her there were pieces left behind, traces in the dust that might speak the truth the girl could not yet say. She made her way through the streets bundled in every layer she had, pushing against the wind and the ache in her bones, until the faded green door came into view once more. The dog had not returned, of course. He was still at the shelter, resting with the girl. But his memory lingered there, etched into the snow where his paws had waited, where his body had stood frozen in faith that someone would arrive. She pushed the basement door open again, carefully retracing her steps through the dark, cold interior. The house remained untouched, no tape, no questions, no lights. As if the city had looked away just as it always had. Elsie moved slowly, examining everything not for answers, but for context. The furniture was sparse. A few broken dishes. A toppled lamp. An open drawer in the hallway that still held a child's mitten, small and pink with frayed edges. In the corner of the living room, half covered by a blanket, she found a single photograph in a cracked frame. The girl, a woman beside her, perhaps her mother, and the dog, younger, cleaner, tail wagging in mid-motion. All three stood in front of the same house. But the warmth in the picture had long since faded, replaced now by a silence that clung to every wall. Upstairs, the bedrooms were empty. One of them had bedding still intact, a teddy bear left on the pillow, dust covering everything. Another room had nothing but boxes, some sealed, some open, revealing old books, clothes, school papers. And in the kitchen, on the fridge held by a brittle magnet, a calendar marked only with one date, a week before the snow began. The square was circled in red ink. No notes. No explanation. Just that single marking, now meaningless without a voice to explain it. She took nothing but the photo. She left the house exactly as she found it. On her way out, she paused once more in front of the green door and tried to imagine the hours, the days, that the girl must have spent behind it, waiting for a sound, a hand, a voice. The dog must have returned to that door over and over, refusing to leave. What had happened to the woman in the picture? Why had no one come? The silence around those questions was deafening, but Elsie no longer feared silence. She had lived beside it long enough to know that sometimes it said everything. Back at the shelter, she showed the photo to one of the volunteers. They made a copy. The original she placed beside the girl's cot, tucking it into the fold of her blanket. The child stirred when she felt it. Her eyes blinked open briefly, settling on the image. There was no recognition on her face, but no fear either. Just stillness, as though the past hadn't vanished, but simply gone too quiet for her to hear. And Elsie sat there, watching her, knowing that some truths could not be found in databases or reports. Some truths lived only in the hearts of the forgotten, waiting patiently for someone who would not look away. The next days passed beneath skies that refused to clear. Clouds hung low, pressing their dull weight over rooftops and alleyways, and though the snow had eased, the cold remained, sharp and lingering like a warning that winter still had a hold on everything. Inside the shelter, the rhythms continued as always. Meals prepared, cots checked, names whispered at intake, but something beneath that routine had changed. The girl, still silent, had begun to show signs of slow return. She moved now when touched, not in fear but in recognition. Her eyes followed those who passed, especially Elsie, and when the dog brushed against her side, she reached out with a hand no longer trembling. It wasn't recovery, not yet. But it was life, fragile and present. Elsie kept near without hovering, watching from across the room, sometimes reading aloud from old magazines just to fill the air with something other than silence. The girl never spoke, but she listened. Her stillness now felt less like absence and more like a pause, as if something within her was rebuilding slowly, brick by careful brick. The volunteers did what they could, offering food, clean clothes, warm baths. But it was the dog who remained her anchor. He slept beside her, followed her when she stood, waited for her outside the bathroom door. Wherever she was, he was. And though he bore no tag, no name, no official place in anyone's records, everyone in the shelter had begun to refer to him simply as Guardian. There had been no response yet from the city's outreach. No family came forward. No one claimed the girl, no one matched her to any missing persons file, and no one from that neighborhood seemed to know the house where she had been found. A few names were suggested: old tenants, distant relatives, people who once lived near, but all led to dead ends. It was as if she and the dog had slipped through every net, unnoticed, unnamed, unclaimed. And yet, they existed. They breathed, they moved, they healed. The absence of a record did not erase the truth of their presence. Elsie took it upon herself to be something stable for them, not out of obligation, but from the quiet certainty that she had been chosen by circumstance to stay. She didn't press the girl to speak. She didn't ask questions. She simply showed up, each morning with a new blanket folded over her arm, or a piece of fruit tucked in her coat. Sometimes she brought little things she had found in donation boxes or on the street: a purple hair tie, a pair of mittens with stars, a notebook with only a few pages used. She gave them gently, wordlessly, placing them near the girl and waiting only for a look, a nod, the slight shift of breath that said thank you in a language beyond sound. One afternoon, as the sun tried to break through the clouds for the first time in days, the girl began to draw. No one had expected it. A volunteer had left crayons and scrap paper nearby, and at some point while no one was watching, the girl had picked one up and begun pressing soft green lines into the page. Not shapes, not letters, just movement. The act of creating, of claiming space. When Elsie returned from a walk, she found the drawing folded at the edge of the cot. On it, in shakier but visible form, was the outline of a dog beside a door. She didn't ask for confirmation. She knew what it meant. The girl remembered. She always had. In the evenings, the shelter grew quiet again, the fluorescent lights dimmed, and conversations became murmurs. But around the girl's cot, there was warmth now. She would sit up when Elsie approached, and though she still did not speak, her eyes no longer held the depthless vacancy of before. She met Elsie's gaze. She watched the way her hands moved when she folded a blanket or passed a cup. She observed the world with the slow, cautious attention of someone who had once learned not to trust it, and was now daring to believe it might be different. The photo remained by her pillow. Some days she would look at it, other days not. The woman in the image, still unnamed, held no confirmed role yet. But the girl stared at her often, not with fear, but with a searching gaze, like someone sifting through fog. She hadn't tried to speak her name, hadn't tried to explain what had happened in the house or how long she had been alone. But no one pushed. In that space, surrounded by the slow heartbeat of care, she was allowed to exist without needing to explain. She was healing on her own terms. As the days stretched forward, the shelter staff began quietly discussing next steps. If no guardian came forward, the city would eventually intervene. Papers would be filed. A foster placement would be arranged. There were protocols. But beneath those conversations, there was another current, unspoken but growing. The idea that maybe she was already where she belonged. That maybe the woman who had carried her from that house through the snow, who sat by her side without asking anything in return, who returned each day not because she was paid, but because she chose to, maybe she was more than a bystander. Elsie didn't let herself imagine too much. Life had taught her not to. She had lived for too long in the cracks of systems and kindness, knowing both could vanish without warning. But every time the girl looked at her with eyes that no longer flinched, every time Guardian nudged her hand as if to remind her she was seen, a part of Elsie allowed itself to wonder. Not about titles or permission, but about connection. About what it meant to be found by someone, and to remain. And so, each day continued, not with grand declarations, but with small, repeated acts of presence. A peeled apple, a folded shirt, a hand that lingered just long enough to be felt. In that shelter, surrounded by strangers and snow, 3 lives moved together, a woman who had once believed she was finished, a girl who had been nearly erased, and a dog who had never once looked away. Winter lingered, as if unwilling to loosen its grip on the city. But within the shelter walls, something had quietly changed. The girl, once found curled in silence behind a door, was now sitting upright most days, her eyes alert, her posture no longer defensive. Though she still hadn't spoken, her presence filled the room in ways words never could. Her movements had meaning now. She made choices. She reached for objects instead of recoiling. She walked slowly, hand resting on Guardian's head, her steps cautious but sure. The dog remained her shadow, never more than a few feet away, his watchful eyes fixed on the world as if still expecting it to take her again. Elsie, too, had changed, though she would never say it aloud. The woman who once drifted from corner to corner now had a place she returned to. Not because she had to, but because she was wanted. She sat beside the girl at breakfast, walked with her during quiet hours, and watched over her at night when the shelter dimmed its lights. Without ceremony or paperwork, something had taken root between them, something earned, not claimed. She didn't need to call the girl her daughter to know she would never walk away. And the girl didn't need to speak the word, mother, to make it true. The shelter staff, who once saw Elsie as a regular guest, now greeted her as part of something larger. They trusted her, included her in meetings, asked her opinion about the girl's care. When city officials eventually came, bringing forms and questions, they found a community already in place. People who had seen what love looked like without needing it defined by law. The caseworker who came to assess the girl's placement stayed longer than expected, her notebook slowly closing as she watched the interaction between the three of them. The girl, the dog, and the woman who had carried them both from the brink of being forgotten. No one argued. No one resisted. The path forward was quiet and clear. Weeks later, on a morning when the snow had finally stopped falling and the sun returned in fragile, golden streaks, the shelter held a small gathering. Not a celebration, nothing formal, but a warm gesture. A new coat, a small cake, a notebook with the girl's name written in pencil across the top. Her name had returned, spoken softly one evening as she traced her fingers across the photograph of the woman she remembered. She hadn't said much else since then, but that word alone had been enough to light the entire room. Her name. Her beginning. Elsie stood beside her that day, not as a savior, not as someone who had fixed everything, but as someone who had stayed. She didn't need credit. She didn't want recognition. What she wanted was the quiet comfort of knowing that in a world that had overlooked her for so long, she had finally made something matter. And it wasn't because she had money, or position, or influence. It was because she had seen someone standing in the cold and chosen not to look away. That green door, the one the dog had watched with such fierce loyalty, remained closed on the street where it all began. The house had since been reported to the city, sealed and scheduled for review. No one knew exactly what had happened there, or why no one had come looking for the girl sooner. But it didn't matter anymore. Because the story didn't end behind that door. It ended with the girl stepping beyond it, carried not by force but by kindness, held by arms that refused to let go. Guardian now walked freely beside them, his fur thick again, his step light. He had become more than a dog. He was part of the story now, its witness, its keeper, its silent hero. In him lived a devotion few people could understand, and many would never forget. And for those watching this story now, those who followed the journey from a shivering dog to a locked door to the warmth of healing, we invite you to stay with us. These stories matter. They remind us that sometimes, the greatest changes come not from systems or speeches, but from a single person choosing to care. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more voices to light, more stories to life, and more hope to those still waiting behind closed doors. Subscribe now, not just to see what happens next, but to be part of why it happens.